It is May 2nd, 2024, and French President Emmanuel Macron is once again doubling down on the threat of sending NATO troops to Ukraine. Now, he claims that this is a completely warranted threat. He insists that if Russia wins in Ukraine, then they are going to target all of Europe next. That this is all about Europe's security. But it makes you wonder just how long can these Western politicians keep telling these lies? How long is the public going to keep believing them? And will they start waking up to the reality of what we're facing here when NATO does start sending troops to Ukraine? When the Ukrainian manpower shortage gets so bad that you have Zelensky looking at his Western backers and saying, well, the only way to keep us standing is for you to send your troops to the battlefield to provide new reinforcements. Are we going to get to that point? And could it happen anytime soon? We got into all of that earlier with a special guest, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. George, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Always good to be with you, Rachel.
Now, I want to get your take on the latest comments from French President Emmanuel Macron, because he has been one of the few leaders in the EU to want to talk about sending NATO troops to Ukraine. This is nothing new from him, but he's specifically saying now that the French threat to potentially deploy troops in Ukraine is necessary, as he calls it, a strategic wake-up call for his counterparts. He also said, quote, if Russia wins in Ukraine, there will be no security for Europe. This was during an interview with The Economist. But what do you make of Macron's latest comments here?
Well, as you say, he's just simply repeating what he had said before. It's not immediately clear what he's trying to say by doing this, because he's saying that the absolute condition for France, something that it can, is a red line in a sense for France, is Russia cannot win in Ukraine. Therefore, he will do whatever is necessary to prevent Russia from winning in Ukraine. Now, he doesn't spell out what he means by Russia winning, and then, but he said, "Oh well, I have to maintain my strategic ambiguity." So, in a sense, he's saying, "Well, I'm kind of bluffing here. I'm kind of making it up as I'm going along, but I want to create an uncertainty in the minds of Russia's leaders that if you go past a certain point, then France will deploy its forces." But it doesn't really spell out in the interview. Well, what is that point? What point it would trigger France's military intervention? Now, so at times it seems like he's saying, well, if they go beyond the lines of contact now, but Russia is going beyond the lines of contact, so he has to mean something else. What is it? If they march into Kiev? So it isn't clear. I mean, it sounds good. France was, well, we now have a major European leader, but you're left again scratching your head, trying to figure out what is he actually saying? What does he plan to do?
Yeah, and that's almost kind of the scary part, right? When he's not laying out a specific red line, you're going, well, wait a second, what are you actually planning? It's so interesting to me that he brings up the security of Europe. And I know this is something that we hear a lot of times from EU officials talking about, oh, their security. But yet, these are the countries that have supported pouring weapons into Ukraine with no accountability, no oversight. And it doesn't take a genius to look at the situation and go, well, wait a second, where are those weapons going to go, right? I mean, we had a report here in the US last year that stated that only 30% of the weapons were actually making it to the front lines. A lot of those weapons, even though the EU doesn't want to talk about it, are being trafficked on the black market. They're not exactly going to get into the hands of their upstanding citizens. They're going to end up going to criminals and drug dealers and those sorts. Why don't you think that that's ever a part of the conversation when it comes to the security of Europe?
Well, because the European leaders and American leaders, Macron, key among them, have wedded themselves to this policy of unconditional support for Ukraine. And again, he says here in this interview, Russia cannot win, because if Russia wins, then there is really, no security for anyone in Europe. So now they are, they have to basically keep repeating that this policy that they pursued, sending in, must be, who knows how much weaponry that they've sent to Ukraine. I mean, 150 billion, 200 billion. We just don't know. These numbers are just so staggering. And so there's no accounting. And there was never, I mean, can you imagine in any other walk of life where there's no accounting, where did 100 billion go? Where did the 200 billion go? And they're not interested in this. And so you're absolutely right in raising the issue. Well, how do you know that they're not being sold on the black market? I mean, weaponry, it always ends up on the black market because there's just so much corruption that goes on in the military procurement process pretty much everywhere. But when you're being gifted, thousands and thousands of pieces of military equipment, well, of course, people are skimming off the top, selling it to God knows whom. But they can't raise this issue without calling into question this insane policy. And again, Macron, who has to explain this policy by essentially this putting forward this absolutely absurd hypothesis that somehow Russia will not stop in Ukraine and that everybody else is somehow under threat from Russia. Well, there's no evidence whatsoever for any of that. Where is any threat that Russia wields against any other power? There isn't. But he has to say it because he has to keep justifying basically a completely unjustifiable policy.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder too. I mean, now that we are over 2 years into this, I always wonder, what do the people on the ground think, right? Are they waking up to this reality that if the real goal of Russian President Putin was to take over all of Europe, I wouldn't think that he would spend 2 years entirely focused on the Donbass, right? You would think that he would go into Kiev, take out Zelensky on day one, and then have a much broader plan or something like that. But he hasn't done that. He hasn't talked about doing that. He's been very specific in kind of his goals and his views here. And now we're seeing the results of this as you have the Ukrainian military struggling. They have a shortage of not just weaponry, but a very serious manpower shortage. And Zelensky is trying to chalk this up to, oh, well, if the West was sending us more aid faster, then we wouldn't have the current problems that we're having. But that's also not the case. What do you make of this current situation and this continued claim that, oh, they just need a little bit more aid and that will solve the problem?
Well, that's how they sell the to the public the need to keep pumping in huge amounts of cash into Ukraine. So the public wants to know, well, why is there nothing for us? There's no investment in infrastructure in the U.S. or in Europe. Nothing in order to improve the lives of ordinary people. Nothing even for border security, which is somehow is supposed to be this really big issue for Republicans in the United States. I mean, there's border security, so there's nothing for that. But apparently, there's a kind of limitless well of funds for Ukraine, but they have to keep changing the story in order to keep justifying the dispersal of funds. Because if you say, well, now that you've got all this money, you should be able to go out and win this war. Well, then that's a bit difficult because then you haven't really, if you don't win the war, then you say, well, what are we going to do now? We're going to keep sending you some more. So you have to then say, yeah, that's good. But we need a little more. And then you give them some more. Yeah, that's fine, but we need some more. The story has continued to change because if you recall, back in 2022, the way they justify pouring in weaponry into Ukraine was by saying that Russia was really doing very badly and Ukraine was doing very well. So because Ukraine is doing very well, we need to give them more, because then they can beat Russia, push them out, and we'll all be living happily ever after. Then that story changed, and they said, well, unless we send stuff now, right away, Russia's going to win this one. So you have to just keep, coming up with some new justification. So that's why the moment Zelensky got this 61 billion dollars worth of goods, he has to say, yeah, that's fine, but I'd like some more, please. And of course he is going to get it, because if you've already given him however much, 61 billion now, but if you go back to 2022, well over 100 billion, you can't very well say, well, that's it, nothing further, because you say, well, we've invested all this amount, we have to keep investing more, because otherwise we'll have just wasted all this money.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the weird, I guess, the sunk cost fallacy that you kind of get into, or that the U.S. government portrays. Right? They're like, and they did this with Afghanistan, right? We've given them so much time and money and everything. We have to keep doing it. And it's like, okay, are we winning? Are we getting anything out of this? Are you, accomplishing anything? No to all of the above. Yet they keep doing it anyway. And we've seen this with Zelensky, as you were pointing out. I mean, I remember a time when he wanted those Abrams main battle tanks. That was the big thing, that he just wanted Abrams tanks, and then he gets them, and then he's on to F-16s, right? And then he's on to long-range missiles. There's always something new on the wish list where you're right, he'll go, okay, thank you so much, but now we've got to focus on this other thing. And he does kind of really focus on the fact that, especially in recent months, the US and the EU have been in a place of debating back and forth on, okay, what are we going to send? How much are we going to send? It hasn't been like in early 2022 where they were basically just handing out military aid left and right and saying, whatever we can do for Ukraine, we're going to do. Because now we're over 2 years into this, and they're looking at the current situation and going, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? And what can we convince the people that we're trying to accomplish? When it comes to the public view, especially there in the EU, do you think that has shifted at all when it comes to Ukraine? Or is it just kind of on only certain countries that they are the ones that have been more critical?
Well, it's very interesting, because, of course, they've never spelled out what their goals are in Ukraine. Because, of course, the reality is they want to keep the war going in order to hurt Russia as much as possible, to kill as many Russians as possible, to wreak as much destruction on Russia as possible. The problem is that you can't really spell that out to the public, because the public will, just say, "Hey, that's not nice," and we just we're spending money on a war whose purpose is just to kill as many people as possible and to destroy as much as possible. That's not a good objective. So then you have to say, "Oh yeah, but that's the goal is to defeat Russia and to topple Putin." Well, that was okay. You could say that in 2022, but of course that's just not on now. I mean, no one really buys into the idea that Russia can be defeated. So you can keep the war going, but it's not credible to keep saying that you have any chance of defeating Russia. So now you come up with a new line. Well, if we don't spend this money, then Putin will be on the march. Putin is going to be at the English Channel. He's going to be, crush everyone before him. So yeah, that's the argument. Well, people say, well, okay, well that sounds really nasty. That it'll be Hitler once again, on the march. But the point is that they can't come up with the reality. They can't spell out the reality. Is you are just keeping the war going. You don't have any objectives here other than just to keep a war going. You haven't spelled out any strategic objective, any kind of peace terms that you would accept, and that's why this amazing thing, which is that Russia has given every indication that it is actually interested in a negotiated peace. NATO and the West have given no indication of that. None at all. No indication at all of what kind of terms would they accept. This war has been going on 2 years now. It'll soon be 2.5 years, and even now, NATO refuses to spell out any kind of terms that it would think, okay, that's fine. Let's just bring this war to an end.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I know that they love to kind of put it on Zelensky, right? They claim that, "Oh, well, it's up to Zelensky's terms," and he'll sit there and he'll claim, "Oh, I want, all of Crimea and all of the Donbass." And it's like, well, again, another wish list, that's great, but good luck getting the people there to want to live under your control. Or they'll say, "Oh, Zelensky has this great 10-point peace plan," and then you look at the peace plan and it's literally the unconditional surrender of Russia at every possible point. And it's like, okay, so the West has that focus. But when it comes to the position that we're currently in, which is that, it seems like the West is just trying to do the bare minimum to kind of keep the Kiev regime alive, so to speak, to just keep them fighting another day. But they continue to deal with this very serious manpower shortage. You have Zelensky in this position of trying to force Ukrainian men abroad back home, but that's not exactly a really massive strategy that is going to come up with major results. Are there concerns about NATO troops, as Macron was kind of pointing out there, being the ones to be called on to fill those gaps if this manpower shortage in Ukraine continues to go on and you continue to see less and less men ready to fight?
Well, that's a very good question because in that scenario that you've just outlined, then the pressure is going to build on Macron because Macron has now put this out there, and if that happens, suddenly Ukraine really is unable to continue fighting because of this manpower shortage. Then people say, yeah, but Macron said that that France is ready to step in because it has to prevent a Russian victory. And he, in this interview with Economist, he suggests, well, if Ukraine asks us, and so far Ukraine hasn't asked us, but he does say, if Ukraine asks us. So I don't see why Ukraine wouldn't ask, well, look, hey, we're facing complete defeat. You said you were ready to bring your forces in, so how about it? That'd be interesting. How Macron's going to could worm himself out of that. It's all very well saying, "Oh, we're just maintaining strategic ambiguity," but there's going to be a point that we just say, "Okay, well, you got to put up or shut up," because if you are not going to send in your forces, then you really need to then accept, okay, well, we're going to accept, defeat in Ukraine. So it's a very dangerous game he's playing here because sooner or later, his bluff is going to be called. Just to say, well, I'm just maintaining strategic ambiguity. Well, there's a limit to how long you can maintain ambiguity.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's also notable to me too because if Macron were to come out today and say we are sending French troops into Ukraine, you know that especially in France there would be protest, even riots in the streets against it, I would think, right? You're going to have the French people who say, we're not going to go fight and die for Ukraine. Sure, you can send them money and weapons, but we're not going to risk our lives fighting for them, especially when they're not winning. But there's also the concept of kind of boiling the frog here, right? You have Macron come out every few weeks, maybe every month, and he makes some comment on this and he talks about the need for NATO troops in Ukraine. He talks about, this supposed threat of Russia taking over Europe and that they need to fight back. Is there a concern that the public could get conditioned to one day in the future say, okay, we're going to have to accept that NATO troops are going to have to fight in Ukraine? Or is there some hope there that because things have gone so poorly, they are kind of waking up to the fact that our governments dragged us into this and sold us a bunch of lies about how Russia was going to fall and all of this was going to happen and none of it did?
Well, that's a very good question. What will the public tolerate? I would have thought the public would not accept the loss of French lives in Ukraine. The problem is that Ukraine has a legitimate beef with France and with NATO and the United States, because it's all very well, or they're all saying, they keep patting Ukraine on the back, you're doing a great job there, you're fighting for us, you're the one who's leading the resistance against Russia. If it weren't for you, Russia would be, sweeping on the channel, so great job, Zelensky. Well, there's a point at which he's going to say, yeah, that's very nice, all this backslapping. How about you, join us in the trenches? That's the point, and I think that's a reasonable argument to make. Well, you've said this is an existential matter for Europe. This is what Macron says. This well, then you got to put your money where your mouth is. You join Ukraine on the front lines. It's a little like the Sunshine Warriors in the West, who always want to start a war, but they're not themselves ready to go fight for it. All the various, the Sunshine Patriots, or the Chicken Hawks. Oh yeah, we got to send American forces here, American forces there. Bomb this country, bomb that country, but they never serve in the military. They make sure that their children never serve in the military, but they're always ready for other people to die for all their causes. So it's something similar here with Ukraine. Yeah, fantastic. We will have to. It's an existential matter to fight against Russia. But for some reason, it's only Ukraine who's going to be doing it. The rest of us, we're just standing in the background. We don't actually risk anything. We don't lose even one meal. So that's why there may well come a point at which Zelensky is going to say to Macron, "Okay, well, this is it, buddy. How about sending some forces?"
Yeah, no kidding. It's always interesting how it's the politicians who champion these wars, right? They say this is what we need to do, and then they're never the ones volunteering to go to the front lines themselves. Certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's always a pleasure.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, be sure to check out my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.